Guys, let's with a very interesting story from hippo_singularity. There's a reason they have those limits in place, Chad. The big industrial and infrastructure jobs are always an exercise in logistics at a concrete plant. It takes about 40,000 pounds of concrete to fill a standard 10 cubic yard, about 2,020 gallons, drum. All that material has to be brought in by semi. To ship 100 yards, 10 mixes, it is going to take about 3 trucks of rock, 4 of sand, and 1 powder train. A single job can easily be over 1,000 yards. The biggest I have personally seen was over 5,000, and as much of a nightmare as it sounds. So this night, we are running about 2,000 yards on 2 boom pumps. The loads are basically going out back to back as fast as Bob, the plant manager, can load them. I am not in my truck. I am down in the yard directing traffic. The anthropomorphic personification of Putt's law, commonly known as Chad, had decided that this job is too big to let Bob handle things. Bob has only been with the company for 20 years. He is concerned that the drivers will get confused driving the 100 metres across the yard, so I am out there making sure the material trucks go to the material lane, a large grate in the ground where they can dump rock and sand down onto a conveyor belt. The powder trains go to the powder lane on the opposite side of the plant, where the hoses to pump the cement are, and the mixer drivers go to one of the batch lanes directly under the big, whom ping batch plant that they work at every day. Things are fine for the first few hundred yards, but Bob is spending powder faster than the powder trains can unload it. Eventually, the silos run dry, and things slow down to match the unloading rate. This upsets Chad. There are trucks stacked up at the job site, but they are starting to dwindle, while the line of empty trucks at the plant starts to extend out into the street. There is risk of a gap in service. Then we get a reprieve. One of the pumps breaks down, and the rate of work on the job site is cut in half. Bob can slow down enough that the powder trains refill the silos. We even get a couple stacked up and waiting to unload. When we get the word that the second pump is back in action, Bob goes over to the powder lane to tell the drivers that they can start unloading like normal as soon as he finishes loading the next truck. It is at this point that Chad oozes his way over, with all the charm and benign purpose of Sarah Lewis's cesspit. He doesn't want to risk a service gap. He wants the powder trains to start unloading faster, fast enough to match what Bob is sending out. The powder train drivers say they are already unloading as fast as they can. Chad doesn't believe this. He knows the transfer system operates on variable pressure, and the drivers do not operate at the compressor's limit. Cement powder is very fine, and it carries on the air very easily. When delivering cement, air is blasted into the trailer, creating a thick, misanthropic cloud of lung damage and chemical burns. Fortunately, this cloud is trapped inside the trailer, and the only escape is through a hose and up into the silo. The pumping speed by is dependent on the pressure inside the trailer, so what Chad wants them to do is up the pressure to the point where they are putting in powder at the same speed Bob is pulling it out. The drivers refuse to do it. Company policy limits the maximum pressure they can run at. Chad doesn't care. Those limits are there to keep the silo from getting overfilled. With Bob pulling out powder as fast as he is, there should be enough time to shut down if the inventory alarm goes off. The drivers still refuse. Then Chad threatens to fire them for delaying such an important job. Bob and the drivers look at each other, and then Bob unlocks the adjacent storeroom and walks away, while the drivers crank up the pressure. When he gets back to the office, Bob tosses me his keys and asks me to move his car over next to mine. Bob normally parks right next to the office, on what is usually the leeward side of the building. I normally park on the east end of the yard. I like it better than the street, but it means my car catches a lot of dust off the plant. So I move Bob's car and start walking back. By this time, Chad has moved up onto the catwalk above the loading lanes, where he can gaze over his efficient little kingdom like Yertle the turtle. Then one of the bag houses burps. If you look at that picture of the powder silos, you might notice what look like miniature silos on top of them. Those are the bag houses. Inside each of them are several dozen felt bags, like 4-foot-long windsocks with one end sewn shut. That end is hung from the roof, while the open end is clamped to holes in the floor, the roof of the main silo. As the air and cement powder is blasted into the silo, those bags act as filters, allowing the air to escape while keeping the cement inside. As best as we can figure, what happened was that the air was being blown in at a high enough pressure that it was packing those bags full of powder and restricting the airflow out. There was no alarm because the powder level was still below the sensor, but the pressure was building up inside. When the pressure finally grew too great, it tore 3 bags, blew open the baghouse door, ripping the lock off in the process, and spewed a mushroom cloud of powder into the air. I am about halfway back across the yard when I see the powder drivers slap their dump valves and dive into the storeroom. A couple seconds later, somebody turns off the moon. A couple seconds after that, the penny drops, and I race for the office at a dead sprint. Chad is still up on the catwalk. Chad does not realize what has just happened. Thanks to the massive halogen lamps mounted all over the plant, he does not notice lack of moonlight. He has no clue that directly above him, one of the baghouses is vomiting out darkness like an angry bilious volcano god. All Chad can see is me running into the office and pulling the doorstop, and the drivers all across the yard in front of him frantically rolling up their windows. And then it hit him. Our plant is on the west side of the yard. This is pretty normal in Southern California because the prevailing winds blow in off the ocean. That means that any dust or powder that escapes the plant blows across our yard and has a chance to settle there before crossing into the neighbouring properties. For similar reasons, the baghouse doors open towards the yard. In addition, that means Chad is standing on the east catwalk so he can look across the bulk of the yard. Finally, that means that when falling powder was caught by the Santa Ana winds that had been blowing on and off all night, it got pushed straight back into Chad's face. The stuff came boiling down across the catwalk, hit the ground, and flooded out both sides of the loading lane. It was the kind of thing you expect to see Dwayne Johnson running away from, a semi-dysfunctional sibling unit in tow, about to learn a valuable lesson about life, love, and/or family, while O Fortuna blares over the house speakers. The mess it made was glorious, especially in the break room, which had an open door facing the loading lane. The people inside were pissed. Things could have been much worse. Fortunately, since the powder drivers were expecting it, usually the immediate response to a baghouse failure is for the driver to stand there dumbfounded for a couple seconds and then shut everything down. These guys killed the system in both silos immediately. Still, there was a lot of pressure in the silo, and it doesn't take a lot of powder to make a huge cloud. We also had to run for the rest of the night with the torn bags. I did rebolt the door closed. After the shift ended, I took a little drive downwind of the plant. There was cement powder in parking lots a half-mile away. Now, in normal circumstances, a blown baghouse is going to cause an investigation, and someone is probably going to be suspended or fired. These were not normal circumstances. AQMD got wind of what happened. The air quality management districts are the boogeyman of the construction industry. If you've ever driven past a construction site, you have probably seen the big signs that say, if you see dust coming from this project, call, and several phone numbers. One of those numbers is always for AQMD, usually the last one because the contractor is hoping for a chance to fix things before AQMD shows up. Just arriving on site is enough to completely shut down operations, while a bunch of 300-pound truckers and construction workers peer fearfully through the blinds at a little white pickup and its 110-pound occupant. The reason for this bowel-voiding fear is that AQMD can levy absolutely stupid high fines. In California, the cap is $1 million per day per violation, though you would basically have to be a Captain Planet villain to actually get a fine that high. Now, AQMD can't prove it was us. Technically, another plant could have blown a baghouse during an overnight delivery, but we were the only plant running a large night job in the area. They know it's us, and that is putting us under greater scrutiny. Corporate doesn't particularly like that, so the investigation gets kicked up a notch. Blame is immediately leveled at the driver whose silo blew. Between him, The other driver and Bob, however, it soon becomes apparent that he had been forced to violate policy by Chad. More than that, Chad was in charge of the ready mix division, but the powder drivers fell under the authority of the materials division. He had been threatening an employee he had no authority over. Technically, the materials division is a separate company from ready mix. Corporate wasn't about to just fire one of their highest ranking executives, since that would look bad. Instead, Chad was promoted and given a larger office with a spectacular view of the San Bernardino Mountains. In addition to his duties with the ready mix division, Chad was put in charge of the construction of new facilities. Of course, at that time, the only facility under construction was the new quarry. Unfortunately, the quarry was nowhere near the corporate office or Chad's house, so his desk was relocated on site. There wasn't anything permanent up at the quarry yet, so Chad's new office was converted from a steel container. It had a corrugated metal awning to keep direct sunlight off the roof, a couple windows cut in the sides, spray-on insulation all over the inside, and a wall-mounted AC unit. It also had a portable toilet planted next to it because there was no plumbing or on-site water yet. It did, as stated, have an absolutely spectacular view of the mountains, though that would probably have been more enjoyable without all the noise and dust from the construction. To his credit, he lasted 3 whole weeks before deciding it was time to retire. TLDR. An upper manager threatened the job of 2 drivers unless they violated safety limits on their equipment. It ended up causing a minor disaster from which almost everyone but said manager found shelter. He was transferred to a site with minimal facilities in the middle of nowhere and quit shortly thereafter. Won't get me a much-needed PC upgrade to properly do my job? Okay, I'll make you watch me work. This was a masterpiece of malicious compliance. Chad's arrogance led to his own downfall. He got buried in the cloud of cement and was finally demoted to a minor position. This is why, it is said, arrogance finally leads to downfall. And the same happened with Chad. The next story from Relic. I run the parts room at an independently owned auto body and collision repair shop. We'll call the owners Mr. and Mrs. Bossman. We do mostly insurance repairs and always have between 20 and 50 vehicles on property in various states of repair, depending on how busy we are. Once the estimate for a specific vehicle is approved, my job is primarily to order all the parts for the repair, track and receive, and organize all the parts for all ongoing repairs as they arrive, input the invoicing, and process any returns for wrong, damaged, unnecessary parts and such. Plus, IT work, because apparently I'm the only person there who knows you can just Google a problem, and somebody has usually already posted the answer on a message board from 6 years ago. I complain a lot, but in actuality I very much like my job, and I've become exceedingly good at it over the years. My co-workers are generally pretty great, there's almost no office drama, I don't usually deal with the general public, and the owners are mostly solid bosses, a husband and wife team. Mr. Bossman runs the day-to-day shop, and he is there on site pretty much every day, while Mrs. Bossman comes in periodically to do the books, which she watches like a hawk. Mr. Bossman is a decent guy so far as bosses go, but Mrs. Bossman is great. She's just one of those high personality types who's all peaches and sunshine and rainbows 90% of the time, right up until the moment something doesn't go entirely her way. At which point she drops the smile and becomes the stubbornness, immovable object you've ever butted heads against. May God help you if you actually anger her. She's not a Karen in the slightest. She's just an elemental force of nature, and you can bend like the reed or break like the twig. So I deal with Mr. Bossman on a daily basis, and only deal with Mrs. Bossman a few times a week when she needs something for accounting. My default work ethic used to be set to sack of potatoes, but that doesn't fly with the Bossman, and especially not Mrs. Bossman. I have learned the hard way to be very, very proactive in my duties, which is directly why I'm now a great parts guy. Didn't take long to find out that it's just far easier and safer to be able to redirect the coming storm with knowledge and paper trails than it is to face the fury head-on with laziness and ignorance. She always says, the 3 most important rules to follow in this industry are 1. cover your ass. 2, cover your ass. And 3, cover your ass. To which I'd add a fourth rule. Always send an email beginning with, per our phone call, I'd just like to remind you. Always have an email. Saved my ass so many times, becomes relevant later. And she freaking loves me because I have become exceedingly excellent at making her job easier through diligent bookkeeping. As you also might imagine, doing all this ordering and invoicing and emailing and such demands heavy use of a computer, and for years I had to make do with one that was never built nor intended for the task. It wasn't even very old, just an underpowered tablet-style budget computer originally only meant for the shop foreman to occasionally check estimates. At any given time, I had to run our estimating software plus 2 to 4 price-matching programs, and their accompanying background scanning programs, plus multiple Chrome windows for email and parts vendors and parts finder websites, plus image software to view repair photos or edit diagrams to email back and forth. The budget computer had 2 gigs of RAM and a dual-core 1.3 GHz processor. It could barely handle running Notepad if you had the main estimating software running, and it made my job painfully slow, even at the best of times. For 4 years, I'd mention it to Mrs. Bossman, and it was always, "Oh, right, I keep meaning to look into that." And then nothing. But that was better than bringing it up with Mr. Bossman. Mr. Bossman was a former repair technician before they opened their own shop together, so anything on the office end is already good enough until it breaks and not worth wasting more money on in his eyes. All the upgrades should be on the production side of the shop, since that's what he knows well. She's much more practical about office upgrades, thankfully. Anytime I'd mention how slow my computer was and how much it was slowing down my work, he'd just laugh it off and say, "It does the job, don't it?" and walk away, far too pleased with himself. Mrs. Bossman had been going back and forth with a specific vendor that was arguing against some outstanding credits and unpaid invoices that didn't match our numbers, which means they don't match my numbers, so she came into my office to ask me to look into them as normal. But today is not normal. It's especially busy, and I'm already a day behind where I should be. Cue malicious compliance. This time, I decided that, unlike normal, my workload was light enough, that I totally had the time right then and there and could look them up for her right on the spot instead of bringing her the files later that day. This seemed urgent after all. So I began searching our database for the problem invoices and very deliberately and thoroughly went through every program I possibly could, opening every estimate and reconciliation and digital footprint to pull up any scrap of even slightly relevant information for her, so that she had all the relevant info to argue with the vendor. Each new screen freezing and pausing and loading anew. Each new refresh taking more of those long-form, time-dilated seconds to complete. Those seconds that drag on and on and on, like waiting for a traffic light to turn. I was just being properly diligent, you must understand. "Oh, here it is," I'd say, in my most matter-of-fact, perfectly normal, everything is fine and standard and typical voice. "Yeah, that part was returned back on... Oh, let me pull up the credit memo." Oh, actually, that just shows when I generated the return, but not when the vendor actually took it back. Actually, I remember this one now. The driver didn't leave a return confirmation slip, so I think I sent the vendor a reminder email about that. Let me pull that up. Yes, I told them about the issue 2 months ago, and, oh, this is a follow-up email that was part of another chain. Let me forward you both of those. And actually, I think I can still pull up the estimate here since it has the full reconciliation. Uh-oh. I hope it didn't freeze completely. Just wait a sec and it usually catches back up. She kept her smile up, but I could tell it had shifted and she was getting annoyed. "Does it always take you this long to look up the invoices?" I could tell she was getting really impatient, but she couldn't say anything about it since I was doing exactly what she'd just asked of me. And she does normally love that I'm this thorough, so long as she's not waiting in real time. "Huh? Oh yeah, this is normally like this," I said casually. "It's kind of frustrating sometimes, but Mr. Bossman doesn't want to buy another computer since this one does technically do everything I need it to do." Perfectly innocent moon eyes. It doesn't slow me down too much, not usually. Blink, blink, puppy dog face. I continued doing this for all 5 or so problem invoices, and honestly, it was a 100% typical thing to look up, and really only took maybe 15 minutes total in the end. The only difference was making a big show of it while intentionally making it look like I wasn't making a show of it, but that was enough. Well, I really think we need to look into getting you a new computer. This can't be good. Be good for production turnaround if it's always being this slow. Huge success. Storm of Fury successfully redirected from self to vendor, armed with time-stamped acknowledgements for every rogue charge, and finally knowing the crap I have to sit through each and every time I double-click. With all the invoices and credits properly tracked on our end, vendors accounting had to admit the fetch-up had been on their end, and we had been billed in error. I'm not always right, but even when I'm wrong, I can usually pull up a time-dated email to make it look like I wasn't wrong. Bend a little, and the hurricane may just pass you by for a less prepared target. She waited a few weeks to find a good deal, but sure enough, I had a new computer shortly thereafter that is much more capable of running everything I need to run without derping out on me, and it's been an absolute champion. Decided to write this because it's been almost exactly 2 years working on the new machine that's still going strong, and just today I got an unrequested raise for good performance, so I'm feeling overly pleased with me. TL, Decar. Boss man didn't want to waste money upgrading a work PC to actually handle the workload I needed it to handle, so I made his wife actually sit and watch me while I did the tasks she asked for, prompting an almost immediate upgrade. This was a masterclass in subtle but effective malicious compliance. OP played the long game, made Mrs. Boss experience the pain of working at an inefficient system firsthand, after which she realized that OP was right. As a result, OP not only got a new and efficient system, but also an unexpected raise. The execution was indeed perfect,